The year was 1886, and the wind off the Kansas plains blew colder than a banker's heart. Folks in Ashridge knew that sort of wind carried more than dust. It carried stories, some half true, most better left untold. Jedediah Boone wasn't a man for stories. He was a man of land and labor, calloused hands and few words. A rancher by trade, he worked from sunup to sunfall, and what he couldn't fix with fence wire or a hammer, he figured wasn't worth fixing. But when word came that his brother had died out near Fort Garrison, leaving behind a young widow and 2 small boys, Jed didn't hesitate. He saddled his best gelding, rode 3 days without stopping save for sleep, and arrived with nothing but a sense of duty and a quiet kind of sorrow he didn't wear on his face. Her name was Maybelle. She wasn't the kind of beauty you found in dime novels, no golden curls or doe eyes. She was all steady hands and tired smiles, her strength carved out from sorrow and survival. Her boys, Eli and Jonah, clung to her like morning mist to prairie grass. Jed wasn't one for children, nor for women who looked at him like they could see the things he tried not to remember. But when Maybelle opened the door of that weather-beaten homestead and looked him in the eye, something shifted. Not love, not yet. Just a recognition. Like 2 old mules, finally yoked to the same plow. They married the next Sunday. Not out of passion, out of necessity. The preacher read from his Bible with frost on his beard, and the only music was the wind moaning through bare branches. Maybelle wore her morning dress still, black as night, and Jed wore the same coat he'd patched twice already. There was no kiss, just a nod, and then a life begun. He moved into the little farmhouse with her and the boys, and from that day forward, his hands worked not for himself, but for them. The days were hard. Morning started with the rooster's crow, and ended with bones aching in quiet. Maybelle cooked while Jed split logs, and when supper came, they ate in silence, save for the boys' laughter echoing off the walls. At night, she'd sit in the rocker, mending socks or reading from the good book, while he stared into the fire like it owed him answers. But slowly, without fuss or fanfare, things started to change. Jed noticed it first in the sound of her humming, soft, like wind in tall grass. Then in the way she laughed, not often, but real. The boys had always clung to her, but now they followed Jed too, asking questions about fence posts and horse tack, wanting to ride beside him as he worked the land. One evening, after a long day of branding calves, Jed returned to find a fresh pie cooling on the windowsill. Peach, his favorite. He hadn't told her. Somehow she knew. He sat at the table, boots still dusty, and looked across at Maybelle as she poured him coffee. Their eyes met. "You work too hard," she said simply, and he felt something in his chest shift again, something he couldn't name. He didn't know it then, but that night marked the first time he dreamed of something more than land and duty. He dreamed of her. Spring rolled into Ashridge quiet-like, the way a woman tiptoes through a house with sleeping children. Snow melted into the thirsty dirt, and the prairie grass woke up green and full of promise. Jedediah Boone felt the shift not just in the land, but in his bones. Every morning, Maybelle rose before the sun and brewed chicory coffee. Jed took it with silence, like always, but now he found himself waiting for that sound, her footsteps, soft on the kitchen boards. It was the kind of sound that made a man stay upright when his muscles wanted to fold. The boys had taken to him. Sure enough, Eli shadowed Jed every time he hitched the wagon, asking questions about crops and cattle. Jonah, the younger one, liked to sit beside him on the porch come sundown, lean his head against Jed's side, and say nothing at all. And that meant more than any thank you ever could. But it was Maybelle who stayed in his mind long after the work was done. One evening, he returned from the fields with mud caked to his boots and a splinter the size of a matchstick in his palm. Maybelle took one look, fetched her needle and bottle of carbolic, and sat him down at the kitchen table. "You're lucky it didn't go deeper," she said, her fingers working gentle as creek water. Jed winced, more from her touch than the sting. "You always this careful," he muttered, trying not to meet her eyes. "Only when it matters," she replied, and her voice held something deeper than duty. That night, she didn't sit by the fire with her mending. She joined him on the porch. The moon rose fat and full, casting silver across the fields. The boys were asleep, their soft breaths drifting through the open windows. Maybelle folded her hands in her lap. "You ever think about your own family?" she asked softly. Jed cleared his throat. "Ain't much to think on. Folks gone. I had a brother. You knew him." She nodded. "He loved you, even if he didn't say it. Told me once he wished he was more like you." That struck Jed square in the chest. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman beneath the widow's veil. Not just a mother, not just a cook or caretaker. A woman who'd carried grief without buckling. Who'd taken him and not for love, but now maybe, just maybe. He reached over, took her hand. Rough fingers to rough fingers. Maybelle didn't pull away. The fire between them didn't burn like lightning. It burned like embers banked deep in winter, slow, steady, undeniable. And for the first time since he said, "I do," on that wind-bitten hill, Jedediah Boone wondered if he was meant for more than duty. By midsummer, the Boone homestead had taken on a rhythm. Wheat grew tall in the field, chickens scratched like they had secrets to tell, and the boys chased each other through the pasture with whoops that echoed into twilight. Jed caught himself smiling more. Not often, but enough that Maybelle noticed. One night, as the lantern flickered low and the dishes were stacked clean and quiet in the basin, Jed stood beside the fire and said, "You make this place feel like it's got a soul." Maybelle looked up from her stitching, her eyes steady. "And you make it feel like it's got a future." They didn't speak after that. Didn't need to. She reached out, rested her hand on his arm, and left it there until the fire burned down to orange coals. But trouble's like rain on the prairie. It comes when the sky's still blue. Jed rode into town a week later for nails and molasses, but ran headfirst into a face he hadn't seen in a dozen years. Virgil Harkness, mean as a bull snake, with a chip on his shoulder and a mouth that liked to run faster than his wits. Jed and Virgil had ridden the same cattle drive once, long before Jed settled. Virgil had a way of finding shortcuts and excuses, neither of which Jed had much patience for. "Well, I'll be," Virgil drawled from the porch of the general store. "Jed Boone, as I live and breathe. Heard you married that widow out near Wild Creek. Was it for love, or just charity?" Jed didn't say a word, just kept loading his supplies. Virgil chuckled. "You always were the quiet kind, but you know what they say about quiet men, they break easiest." Jed's jaw tightened. He paid for his goods, tipped his hat to the clerk, and walked out slow. He didn't look back, but the words followed him home like burrs under a saddle. That night, as he lay beside Maybelle, separate bed still, though closer now, he stared at the ceiling. The shadows of the rafters stretched like long fingers. He wondered if Virgil's words might carry weight with others. Did folks think he married her out of pity? Did she? He didn't sleep. Next day, Jed rose early and worked the back field till the sun stood straight overhead. Maybelle brought him water, and as he drank, he finally spoke. "You ever feel like I made you less free?" She blinked. "What? Like maybe you'd be better off without me." Maybelle studied him for a long moment. Then she reached out, wiped the sweat from his brow with her sleeve. "You didn't take anything from me, Jed. You gave me peace. Gave the boys a father. Gave me something I'd long since buried, hope." He looked down. "I ain't always good with words." She smiled, small and warm. "Then let your heart do the talking." That evening, he moved his things from the spare bed into her room without a word, and she didn't stop him. It was early fall when the first real storm rolled in from the west, black clouds roiling like a kettle left too long on the fire. The wind picked up dust and memories, and by sundown, the sky looked ready to break wide open. Maybelle was in the root cellar, counting jars of pickled beans and dried apples, when she heard the first crack of thunder. Jed was in the barn, securing the livestock, his voice low and steady as he calmed the horses. Jonah clung to her skirt, wide-eyed. "Ma, is it going to blow the roof off?" "No, sugar," she said, though her voice trembled. "We've weathered worse." By nightfall, the wind howled like a wolf at the door, and the rain came down in sheets thick enough to drown the stars. The family huddled by the hearth, fire sputtering, windows rattling in their frames. And then came the knock. A hard, insistent pounding, 3 raps in rhythm. Jed rose slow, his eyes like flint. Maybelle stood too, heart climbing her throat. Outside stood Virgil Harkness, soaked to the bone, a rifle slung over his shoulder and a sneer on his lips. "Well now," he said, stepping into the glow of the lantern. "Wasn't sure you'd answer." Jed's hand twitched, but he didn't reach for his own rifle yet. "Storm's bad," Virgil continued, dripping on the floor like a stray dog. "Thought I might take shelter with an old friend." Maybelle moved behind the boys. Jed didn't move from the doorway. "You got no friends here, Virgil." Virgil laughed low. "That's so. Thought maybe I'd remind you what you owe. What you ran from back when we were both younger and dumber." Jed stepped forward. "What I owe is a quiet home, a warm fire, a family that don't look over their shoulders." "You always were self-righteous," Virgil hissed. "I ever tell you what it felt like, getting left behind in Amarillo while you rode off with the best stock and the cleanest reputation?" Jed didn't flinch. "You ever tell the truth, Virgil?" For a moment, the storm outside went quiet, like it too was waiting. Then Maybelle stepped forward, her voice like a bell. "You're not welcome here, Mr. Harkness. This is our home." Virgil sneered. "Funny. You talk like you own the place." "I do," she said, "with a man who earns it every sunrise." That broke something in Virgil's face. He lunged, but not with the rifle, just rage. Jed met him halfway, a storm of his own. It wasn't a long fight. Just one punch, clean, practiced, final. Virgil crumpled like wet paper, the storm outside clapping its approval. Jed hauled him outside, tossed him onto his own sorry horse, and sent him riding into the night, rain swallowing him whole. Back inside, Maybelle was tending a split on Jed's knuckle when she said, "You didn't have to do that for me." Jed looked at her, eyes soft for the first time in days. "No," he said, voice rough. "I did it for us." She wrapped his hand in linen. "Then let's keep fighting. Together." After the storm cleared, the land breathed again. The field soaked up the rain like a parched tongue, and the air smelled of damp earth and wild promise. The boys returned to their mischief, their laughter rising like smoke through the rafters, and Maybelle sang soft hymns while hanging laundry beneath a sky that finally showed blue. Jedediah Boone found himself watching her more than he should. Not out of lust, no, this was different. He watched the way her hands moved steady as a clock, the way her eyes followed the boys with a love that didn't shout, just showed up every single day. And in those quiet moments, he realized something that struck deeper than any fight he'd ever been in. He loved her, not the way folks in books spoke of. Not sudden, not breathless, but deep, like water in a well that never runs dry. Still, he didn't say it. Words had never been his tool of trade, but he showed it. In the fence he mended before she asked, in the warm socks he placed by the fire, in the way he taught Jonah to ride without raising his voice. One crisp October morning, as frost clung to the window panes, Maybelle placed a warm biscuit on his plate and said, "You've been awfully quiet these past days." Jed nodded, chewing slow. "Just thinking." "About what?" He met her eyes. "What I got and what I never thought I deserved." She stared at him, the edges of her mouth twitching, like maybe she was holding back more than a smile. "You've always deserved this, Jed," she said, voice soft. "You just didn't believe it." That night, he reached for her hand by the fire, held it like a man afraid he'd drop something fragile. "I know I married you out of duty," he said finally, voice low. "But that ain't why I stay." Maybelle turned toward him. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something steadier. Acceptance. Maybe even joy. "I know," she whispered. They sat like that for a long while, the fire crackling, the house breathing quiet around them. In a town that judged, in a land that asked more than it gave, two weary hearts had found their footing, slow, sure, together. Winter came early to Ashridge, riding in on a wind sharp enough to carve stone. The Boone homestead stood firm, smoke rising from its chimney like a banner of defiance. Jed and Maybelle had found their rhythm, two hands on the same plow, two hearts that beat steady even when the world didn't. The boys had started calling Jed Pa without even thinking about it, and when he first heard it, he stepped out to the barn and wept behind a hay bale, silent as snowfall. But peace, like good harvests, never lasted long on the frontier. It was just past sunrise when a telegram arrived in town, brought in by a rider from Junction Ridge. Word spread fast. A man named Ellis Grant was coming, a lawyer out of Topeka, tall hat, slick boots, and a mouthful of papers. Said he had claim to the land Jed now called home. Said the property belonged to Maybelle's late husband. Maybelle took the news hard, her face unreadable as Jed read the telegram aloud. But it was the boys who panicked. Eli asked if they'd have to leave, and little Jonah just clung to Jed's leg like a root wouldn't let go. Jed said nothing, just loaded his rifle and stared out at the horizon. 3 days later, Grant arrived, a polished man, with cold eyes and a voice like vinegar. He laid out deeds, stamped and notarized, claiming the land had passed to the husband's cousin, who'd sold it to a banker in Topeka, who now wanted it back. Nothing personal, he said, just business. Jed looked him dead in the eye. This ain't a business. It's a life. Grant smiled. Then you best start packing that life up. That night, Jed sat by the fire, staring into the flames like they held answers. Maybelle joined him, her hands folded in her lap. You think we're going to lose it? She asked. Jed didn't speak right away. Then he said, I've never had anything worth fighting for till now. She reached out, laid her hand on his. Then let's fight. And fight they did. Jed rode to Junction Ridge to track down old neighbors, anyone who remembered her husband's will. Maybelle dug out receipts, land tax ledgers, and the marriage certificate that tied her name to every inch of that soil. But the fight was stacked. Law wasn't on their side, not written law. But something else was. The town. People came forward, storekeepers, ranch hands, even the blacksmith. Told stories of Maybelle's kindness, of Jed's hard work. Said it wasn't just their land, it was part of Ashridge now. When Grant returned a week later, he found himself met not by one man, but a dozen, lined up at the Boone gate. You can take your papers, the preacher said, but you'll have to go through all of us. The lawyer blinked, stammered, then turned and left without another word. That night, as the first snow dusted the fields, Jed sat beside Maybelle and said, I never thought I'd feel at home anywhere. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Now you do. Spring returned to Ashridge like a warm memory, gentle, golden, and alive with birdsong. The land, once stiff with cold and doubt, now breathed easy. Wheat sprouted green and proud. The chickens laid regular. The wind had lost its edge. Inside the Boone homestead, life moved with quiet certainty. Jedediah rose before first light, as he always had, but now he lingered a little longer by the stove, waiting for Maybelle's soft shuffle across the floor and the smell of chicory in the pot. They didn't talk much in the morning, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence had become companionable, like two old dogs who'd learned each other's ways. The boys grew fast. Eli was near as tall as Jed now, his voice cracking and his questions deeper than soil. Jonah had taken to singing when he worked, just like Maybelle used to in the cellar, soft and unashamed. They didn't speak of the past much. The ghosts still visited, sure, but they no longer haunted. They just lingered. One warm evening, after the planting was done and supper had settled, Jed walked out to the field alone. He stood beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, where the earth dipped low and the stars came out quicker. In his hand, he held a small box. Inside was a ring, not fancy, just a simple gold band, bought with cattle money and the quiet hope of a man who'd never thought himself worthy of such things. When he returned, Maybelle was on the porch, rocking gently, a book in her lap. She looked up, and before he could say a word, she smiled. You look like a man who's finally made up his mind. Jed knelt, slow and careful, like the moment was fragile as eggshell. I married you once for duty, he said. I want to marry you again for love. Tears welled in her eyes, but she laughed, full and bright. Well, it's about time. They were remarried that Sunday, under the cottonwood tree, with the whole town gathered round. The preacher's voice cracked with emotion, and Jonah dropped the ring in the grass twice before Eli scooped it up. There were wildflowers in Maybelle's hair, and Jed wore a new shirt, stiff and uncomfortable, But he didn't mind. They said, "I do," like folks who knew what those words meant. Not promises of perfection, but of persistence, of sticking through drought and dust, through sorrow and silence. And as they kissed, not quick, not shy, the wind swept gentle through the grass, and the land seemed to sigh. They built a life there. Not grand, not storybook, but true. And when Jed lay in bed years later, hair gone silver and hands slower than they used to be, he looked at Maybelle and whispered, "You gave me a life I didn't know I wanted." And she smiled back, eyes still bright, and said, "You gave me a love I never thought I'd find."